welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. I'm your host, Shaun Haney. Thanks a lot for tuning in today. No matter what you are doing on the farm or ranch, we're going to talk about a very, very important topic today. And honestly, I don't think it gets enough attention. And we've had today's guest on realagriculture.com and RealAg Radio before, and I'm looking forward to discussing some of the new research in this area of wild pigs. We've got one of Canada's foremost experts today on this topic. If you have a question or comment for today's guest, all you have to do is enter it in the comment box or the dialogue box or whatever you're watching on. I always have a hard time describing it. On Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, or Twitch, actually. You can make sure you get your questions asked and jump in the conversation. This is participation here at RealAg. It's RealAg Live. Okay, today's guest, let's bring him in here. Let's get started. It is Dr. Ryan Brook. He is out of the University of Saskatchewan. Hey, Dr. Brook, how are you doing today?
Hey, Shaun. Good to see you.
Hey, it's great to chat with you. I really appreciate you joining us here today. Like I said, this is a very, very important topic, and we're hearing more and more about it. I know that when we first met probably, maybe 4 years ago, there was maybe a real lack of attention being paid to what's going on with wild pig populations. Talk about your research at U of S. Give us kind of a broad understanding of some of the stuff you're doing there.
Well, we started just a little over 10 years ago when I came to University of Saskatchewan to start this crazy job at the university. Said, well, what am I going to do for the rest of my career? And one of the things that came high on the list was these wild pigs were becoming more and more of a notion in 2010. And so over the last 10 years, we've been started to look at, are they even out there? That was the early days. People said, well, we don't have wild pigs. They're just escapes. They're not going to survive the winter. So early days, we were just showing that they actually existed. And then people say, well, they're out there, but they're not reproducing. So we had to show evidence of reproduction. And then through collaboration with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, things really changed in 2004, 2005. They started funding our research. We just never have ever been able to really generate any interest in research on wild pigs in Canada. It's just never been a priority or an interest. But the USDA stepped up and said, okay, we're going to give you about a little over $1 million worth of cash and GPS collars and a bunch of other supports. And we went out and started collaring wild pigs. We put out extensive trail camera networks. My PhD student, Ruth, has spent, 4 years of her life out talking to producers and knocking on doors and phoning people, developing this national scale map of pigs. So we developed a map, and now we're updating this map, basically tracking this exponential spread of wild pigs across the landscape at about a little over 80,000 square kilometers per year. So we're really putting numbers to the distribution and showing this unbelievably rapid expansion that none of us ever expected at all.
Yeah, and when I write a story on this topic, I'm always not sure if we should say wild pig, wild boar, feral pig. Like, how are we supposed to phrase it?
At the end of the day, I'm not too hung up. I think everybody knows what we're talking about when we say any of those things. In Europe, where they came from, they're called wild boar, but they're native there. When they were brought over to Canada, pretty much everything was crossbred with domestic pigs. So we very unlikely have few, if any, true domestic wild boar in Canada. Most of the animals you'll see inside a fence and indeed outside on the landscape are a mix of wild boar and domestic pig. And interestingly, just in the last few years, we've seen more and more sightings of pot-bellied pigs out on the landscape as well. And so there's a whole bunch of genetics out on the landscape. And so wild pig is a good generic term that we use, certainly in our writing and our communication, to say that's everything. That includes if there happen to be truly any actual wild boar on the landscape, which would be rare. And the majority of these wild boar domestic pig hybrids, and in fact, there are some, amazingly, some herds of domestic pig, like a Yorkshire pig with no wild boar whatsoever, still free-ranging populations out there. They've become fertilized as well. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, to say the least.
What I find interesting is that provincially and federally, there's not a lot of interest in this topic. I thought maybe that would change with ASF. But USDA is funding a lot of the research that's being done in your program. Why the lack of attention?
Now, it's a good question. I think I'd like to hope that will change at some point, but certainly I don't know why, to be honest. It's been a bit of a bizarrety. And when the US started, my conversation with them is, this is great to get me kickstarted. And once we get going and we get some of these results, I think everybody's going to see how important this is and really want to be part of it. But we just haven't seen that interest yet. It's one of those things that's easy to ignore. These things are also nocturnal. I think if they were more visible and out there on the landscape, people would be much more concerned. But so many people across Canada have 2, 3, 4, 15 living in and around their farm, but they don't even know it because they're often nocturnal, they're highly elusive, and they're just not seeing. So it's one of these problems that we don't necessarily see right in our face until something big happens, like someone hits one on a highway, or in Texas this year, that woman that was killed in her driveway trying to get into her car by a group of wild pigs as well. So it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind. And unfortunately, I think what's going to happen is we're going to get to a point where we have huge numbers like Texas. Texas and Saskatchewan are the same size, and they have, over 3 million animals. And certainly our landscape could easily support well over 1 million, no question.
So why do you think we need to be more concerned about this? What is the negative impact of having increasing populations of wild pigs?
Well, you already mentioned African swine fever, and that was the one that I really thought that producer groups, the domestic pig producer groups, were really going to say, boy, this is the final, straw here. We need to get a handle on this. And to some degree, I think that generated discussion. So disease is a big one for sure. And there's a whole host of parasites and disease that wild pigs might carry and transmit to, interacting with cattle or domestic pig farms, pets, other wildlife, even potentially to humans. So disease is the big one. Crop damage is huge. The U.S. now, their latest estimate is $2.5 billion per year in crop losses alone, just to wild pigs. And so the issue right now, and I've sort of been saying this for a while, is that right now, today, wild pigs are maybe not the worst thing that ever happened to Canada, but just give it a few more years. And they're, as they spread exponentially, and they are, in the Canadian prairies, it's fair to say they are completely out of control, expanding right now. Saskatchewan is a very, very high functioning, as is Manitoba, very high functioning wild pig factory. And so as we're speaking, piglets are hitting the ground and populations are expanding. And so as they get bigger, they get completely out of control. And once they're established like this, there's really not a lot of evidence of, once you get firmly established widespread populations, eradication is virtually impossible. And so really, really, they are listed as one of the worst invasive species on Earth.
Talk about their patterns. And you mentioned once they establish themselves, it's very, very difficult to eradicate. There's not a post or a story that we don't do about this where somebody says, let's just start hunting them. Before we get to eradication, though, talk about some of their patterns and what makes this such a difficult situation to deal with.
Well, so their behaviors, the fact that they're mostly active at night means that, in Canada, we don't allow hunting at night, and these pigs are primarily nocturnal. They also have, what's amazing is these pigs that we've collared, the first and only GPS collaring study in Canada, is that they have huge home ranges. So my colleagues in Europe are collaring pigs, and their home ranges are 3, maybe 4 square kilometers. Ours are 300 to 400 square kilometers. So that's 2 orders of magnitude. It's 100 times larger. These massive home ranges mean they move much more than any other study of wild pigs on Earth by quite a large margin, actually, a huge margin. And so that means that just makes them that much more difficult to find and remove. And so if, someone phones today right now and says, hey, I literally have 12 wild pigs in my back 40 eating at my swath grazing or whatever it is, by the time people get out there, these animals could have moved 30 kilometers easily. And so that really, the large movement that they do, huge movements, unprecedented, and these nocturnal movements, and they also get into this ugly, nastiest cover. So you go in an area and you say, I want to find wild pigs. Well, you go along a river edge where it's just ugly, nasty willows that you can barely walk through. That's where pigs are going to go. And they're super hard to spot in there and even harder to get to.
And destroying crop, I would assume, and obviously a threat to livestock production as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's certainly a concern is crop damage. They consume just about every kind of crop there is, and our collar data show them spending huge amount of time in all sorts of crops, especially corn. Not surprising, given the value, forage value of corn. These animals will make incredibly risky behaviors and do just about anything to find and feed on corn. And they do harass livestock for sure. And there was that video, I don't know if you saw it over the winter, a school bus driver near Prince Albert stopped with his kids in the back and filmed out the window of this very large wild pig, probably 300-400 pounds plus, chasing a cow with some calves and
No.
put the run on him. And it probably wasn't, predation. These are, large cattle, but it does stress them out and push them off feed for sure. And we've had producers say that the pigs scare them so much they've actually had to move the watering area and feeding area for their cattle in winter. And so they harass wild livestock for sure, and they will. We haven't heard much in terms of predation yet, but certainly in the U.S., goat and sheep producers have a lot of losses when wild pigs move in. They gobble up those lambs and kids. So very widespread range of impacts, and we haven't even talked about the environmental impacts, the species at risk, and native habitats as well.
Yeah. And they multiply fast?
They do. What we've documented from our necropsies and also from trail camera photos is that 6 young per litter is the average. And so that's middle. We've definitely had much larger than that as well. So 6 young per litter, multiple litters per year. And these animals are reproducing continuously. So we have trail camera photos of females with young, newborn young or almost newborn young at heel in every season of the year. So they don't, your elk, deer, moose, they have a big, huge rut in the fall, and then they all have their young, within a matter of about 2 weeks. All of the elk, deer, moose have their young in a narrow window, and then they're done for the year. These pigs, they just keep going. And that really means, so your white-tailed deer triplets is amazing. Moose triplets is a big deal. Elk one is standard. Whereas, so for your wild pig, it would be probably around 12 per year. So that's a massive difference in reproduction. And with very little predation, virtually no predation that we're aware of, that just means very high reproduction and lots of recruitment. Those animals are surviving to become adults.
Yeah, so so there's not another species that's going after these wild pigs. They're kind of just free to reign. Like, unless we're bringing dinosaurs back, they're pretty much living on their own.
Well, in their native range, wolves will certainly kill them. And I saw a video from Florida where a black bear grabbed a piglet. And so they may be some predation. But the problem, of course, is that most areas of agricultural, Western Canada, we've removed our big predators. So it would be very unlikely to see a black bear or a wolf in most areas of farmland, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Unless you're right on the forest fringe or near the mountains in Alberta or something, you're pretty unlikely to see any kind of large predator. So there is, outside of human hunters, there's not much out there to have any impact on them.
So how are you tracking them?
Well, we have a few different approaches. One is that we talk to people and get their sightings. And so we have thousands and thousands of sightings from people out in the swath, or they just stop and all of a sudden there's a big group of pigs run out of the crop, or hunters with their trail cameras send us in. We have certainly many thousands of trail camera photos from hunters. We have our own trail cameras as well that we have set up around the prairies. And we're not collaring lately, but we have 4 full years of collar data as well. We're still analyzing and looking at movement patterns. Those collar data are incredibly valuable because they get a location every 3 hours. So 8 locations a day, every single day for a year or more. So lots and lots of data to help inform what these pigs are doing. So it's been kind of it has been really interesting research, totally new, and really nobody else has been doing any research in Canada. So we're kind of doing our own thing.
Hey, there's a question here from Brian. Are wild pigs edible? Could we have a whole bunch of wild pig roasts?
You could, yes. The females are quite tasty. Young ones are quite tasty. These males, of course, being in the wild, will be mostly intact. And so you get that taint from intact males, especially the old, you shoot a 500-pound male. Oh boy. I wouldn't recommend eating that, but certainly the smell of that will haunt my nightmares from those big males. But certainly they are very edible. Lots of people shooting and hunting and eating them. And that's great. And hunters have been a huge collaboration for us. They share photos. They send pictures when they kill them. They have contributed ears along the way for our genetics analysis. So hunters have always been a great collaboration, but the difficult message, which I keep saying over and over, and isn't gaining many friends or influence, but the reality is that sport hunting is not part of this solution. They're just, with that reproductive rate and the way they're so elusive and smart, hunters are not knocking down populations. We're just not seeing that, at least not in North America.
Yeah, for us to hunt, like for us to send out hunters and say, okay, you know what? There's no deer tags. There's no bear. Everybody's this year going out and shooting wild pigs. We wouldn't even put a dent in it, would we?
Not at this point, no. That's the problem, is that there was really no action of any kind really for the first 10, 15 years of this. And so once they become firmly established, and we see, and I've noticed in our research, so in 2010, we saw 4, we saw 6, and then we saw 11, and we were like, wow, 11, that's huge. Well, now, seeing 30 in a trail camera photo is certainly not unheard of. Or as the populations have exploded, we're seeing much larger, what we call a sounder group. Sounder is often the term used for a group of pigs. And we're seeing much bigger sounders. And so, once you get into groups of dozens, the chances of a group of hunters being able to remove all of them is pretty slim.
Do they?
Now, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, there's this really cool group of hunters in southeastern Saskatchewan they're actually cattle producers, and they finally got fed up with nobody doing anything about it, and they were having real problems with the pigs coming in and harassing their cattle and eating their feed. And so they went out and formed a group called the Moose Mountain Eradication Team. And these are local grassroots cattle producers going out on their own dime and their own time. And they went out and have removed a lot of pigs in that southeastern area, that Moose Mountain country, and really cleaned it up a lot. And so there is some success stories there for sure, but staying ahead of it is pretty tough, just given the scope and scale now, where, these pigs occupy 1 million square kilometers now. Like, wrap your brain around that.
That's crazy.
That's a huge area of Canada, right? So, when people talk to me about eradication, well, I'm not saying eradication isn't possible over large areas of Canada, but I think it would be absolutely fair to say at this point that we've just simply completely 100% missed the boat, and they are now part of our, we use the word endemic to mean that now they're part of the landscape, that we had a window there. I think that there was a reasonable chance they could have been eradicated, but that's passed. So, my vision and my suggestion is to, zone Canada into areas where there are some patches. So, for example, central Saskatchewan, especially in that eastern part, that has pigs. And I can't see how that's ever going to be eradicated, but there are large areas, all of BC. Ontario has a really good chance of eradicating. Quebec has a small population. So there are a lot of places that have a pretty good chance of having entire province pig-free and staying pig-free, and big areas in other provinces as well. But we will have pockets for the end of time now.
Yeah, Lara just asked a question. I think you just answered it. But so if hunting isn't going to control them, what other control measures might we have? Is there anything? I mean, because I'm hearing you say no.
Well, there are tools that will work. But, one analogy would be to think of it in terms of, and the comparison I think is very fair, is to think about this in terms of fires, whether, let's say, house fires. We are now at a point where every house in every city in Canada, is within a minutes of having a fire truck there to put a fire out. That's where we have to be in order to be able to get this under control, is a massive scope and scale of effort. It's, killing some pigs here and there is great. And I will say Alberta and Saskatchewan are good examples. They're both out there killing pigs, probably as we speak. And both provinces have got into this idea of these big panel traps. So these are large, 15, 20 feet across, large traps. And you can catch in an ideal world, if you run them well, you can catch entire sounder groups in them and remove them. And so those traps can be very successful. And there's lots and lots of them running in the US, and more in Canada, and Ontario has even started doing some of that as well. The trick with pigs is you can't just have one tool in the toolbox. You need a full toolbox. And so one thing that we've done some trials with, and we're the only ones in Canada that have done this so far, But we have tried the U.S. they call them Judas pigs. So you capture a pig, put a GPS satellite collar, let it go, and then use that pig to find other pigs, because nothing is going to locate pigs faster. Trail cameras, talking to people. People have talked about dogs. There's lots of tools out there you could use, but letting other wild pigs find a group is really, really successful. And so we've shown that can be, you could easily, even on a one-time basis, you can remove 9 pigs for every one collar you put out.
So, but okay, so if you find them though, like what is the answer? Are you throwing a stick of dynamite into the group, or like or is it basically just gunshot? Like what are you doing? How do you take care of them?
Well, in the U.S. Has a very different take on a lot of things than we do. But what they have done is large panel traps for removing big groups, and they also, when they got a huge amount of money for their program, part of which funded all of the stuff that we've done here in Canada. And the first thing they did was bought 2 helicopters and I think almost 1 million rounds of ammunition. And they went out with helicopters and, machine gun, taking out large groups. Nobody's done that in Canada yet. The other thing the U.S. is working very, very hard on right now is a nitrite-based poison. We're having a few hiccups along the way, but I think they're, getting fairly close to that. And so some of these tools may play a role, but what's the public license? What's the social license to go out with poisons and machine gun firing helicopters? That's a tricky one. So
sign me up. A helicopter hanging out the side of it with an AR-15. This sounds like fun, Ryan.
Well, it might be some people's pleasure for sure, and there's no question that it can work. But I haven't seen any provinces that have shown any appetite for that whatsoever.
Okay.
We have used net gun to capture animals, and so we can. So what we did was we put out these Judas pig collars, let them run for 1 year, and then recaptured everything and removed everything that was in those groups. And as I say, on a one-time basis, we got 9 times as many as we put collars out. So they can be effective with that. We capture them with a net gun, and we've trialed that. In 2017, we did a major trial of that. And capture them with a net, restrain them, and then use a penetrating bolt gun. And you can take out entire groups like that quite effectively. It is not cheap, but it's hugely effective, especially for those big males. Males have by far the biggest home ranges. And so when you put a collar on a male, what they do is they basically just wander around the landscape visiting with these sounder groups, which are a big mature female, and then some of her daughters and great-granddaughters and any piglets that any of them will have. And so virtually always piglets in these sounder groups. And what you can do and see from these males is that they travel around and around, often by themselves, and mate with any females, and then move on and just keep going around and around this, what we call a trap line. And so that means that you'll get sounders in these traps and maybe the occasional male, but sometimes you will need a different approach to take out the big males as well as these large sounder groups.
What about sterilization?
It is possible. It's been talked about. The big problem with sterilization, and probably the main 2 reasons that I don't think it's probably worth time and effort, is that if you sterilize an animal and let it go, it can still do 15 years of crop damage and spreading disease and sort of getting into all kinds of trouble of harassing livestock. And so I think that mortality-based methods are the only thing that makes sense right now, unless there's a way, in a widespread way, to if there's through some kind of bait-based feeds, which we don't really have yet. But if that was something where you could do widespread sterilizations, that might work. But right now it's based on individual animals. And so I don't think we're anywhere near success with that. So yeah, we have to look at all these options and think carefully. And certainly, if anybody thinks we're getting out of this on just one technique alone, I think that would be a very, very naive view of wild pigs.
Yeah, it's odd to me. It's sort of odd to me because you think about Alberta, how they view rats, right? Where it's like eradication. We are not allowing rats into this province. And boy, if somebody finds a rat, it's like all effort focused to make sure that we eradicate any sort of a population. Yet on something like this, it's not the same attitude. Much more destructive than rats. I don't get what's missing here.
Yeah, you and me both, brother. I've been scratching my head on this for a while, Shaun, and I don't know the answer. And I mean, I mean, to be fair, there are lots and lots of issues out there for everybody to struggle with, and it's I feel bad for a lot of these folks. Oh God, I've got rats and I've got other problems, and now we've got yet another one in the landscape, and so it's a tough one. And they are, hard to find. They're hard to remove. But you're right, that general view of just saying, like, no one is really out there saying, that I've heard at all, eradicate, eradicate, eradicate. Like you say, that just that mentality of let's get them all and let's get on this. That hasn't been there. It's more like, well, let's get some pigs and we'll find some and we'll do some, and that's great. And I've said many, many times that people that are out removing wild pigs are my best friends. Like, if you're out there and catching and removing, especially full sounder groups of wild pigs, that has my 100% support. But I also think we have to put every one of those captures into context of the big picture. That, like trying to fight a forest fire, where once it gets out of control, and this is where we are certainly in big areas of central Saskatchewan, where, we're not talking about little spot fires anymore. We have raging infernos. How do you deal with those? That's a really tricky one. And as you say, I think the only way to get there is this really over the top mentality of saying, I don't care what anybody says. We have a notion of just going in there with all of the tools in the toolbox, trapping. We're going to get aircraft, which nobody has really embraced either. That's the other thing. In the US, they've really embraced aircraft either in support role or direct removal role. And we haven't got there yet, partly, I think, because of budgets. Nobody wants to put the money into this. The reality is that the more severe these populations get, the more it's going to cost to remove them. 20 years ago, a small amount of money would have gone a long ways, but now we're pretty deep into it.
I vote for drone strikes.
Well, it's interesting. Alberta has been using drones to find them, not the military-style drones at all.
I've been watching too much TV.
Well, but this is a great point, is that I think we really have to open the toolbox and say, okay, well, what are we willing to do? But also, and I've been a big advocate of this too, is saying that, I'm not a big fan of going around the landscape with machine guns blazing. One, they're not as long-term effective as everybody had hoped. And two, there are ethical issues here. I don't think that going full Rambo is the answer either. Yeah. That we have to. I grew up on a farm, and my grandfather and father and my family taught me. You have to do this ethically, and you have to. These animals should be a quick death, and that's certainly front and center for us at the university. Is that we can kill or euthanize animals, but it has to be in a way that's a quick and relatively painless death, not just going out and pray and spray on the landscape or whatever. So, and this is why I think we need a diversity of tactics. But Judas pigs, these ground hunting teams like we have at Moose Mountain, those groups can be exceedingly effective if you've got the right people. And then big traps, just taking lots of animals. But again, one of the phrases that we often use about trapping is it's like cutting your grass. You can go out in a lawnmower and cut your grass today. 4 days later, guess what? You've got as much grass as you ever had because you haven't got to the seed. And that's the problem, is that a lot of trapping, you catch the young and dumb ones, or you may even catch entire groups. But once you're so well established where you have lots of groups and they're widespread all over, simply removing 4 or 5 big groups means that with those reproductive rates, they just bounce right back.
Makes sense. Hey, question here from Jim. Does this fall under provincial PCO jurisdiction?
What's PCO?
I don't know. I was hoping you did. I don't know. We'll come back to that if Jim responds. What is the threat to the domestic pig herd?
I think the threat is disease. I think that's the scary one for sure. Interestingly, there are 2 threats to livestock. I think the main ones are domestic pigs and domestic cattle. Domestic cattle, on these extensive cow-calf operations, you have lots and lots of animals out in the open over large areas. And so in terms of overall direct and indirect contact, I think we're going to see more risk, to be honest, with cattle. But we also have a lot of backyard pig farms. And that's the problem with disease and these big pictures of big picture view of disease and international markets. And we learned this with during my PhD stuff. We were looking at elk spreading TB to cattle, and a herd can be 2 cattle, and that's a strike against us for disease-free status. And so it doesn't take a lot of disease to cause a lot of heartache and pain, as we know from BSE and other diseases. So I have real concerns about what could happen if we ever do get African swine fever. It almost certainly will show up in domestic farms first, but given the very high overlap that we see across the prairies with domestic pigs and wild pigs, I think the potential for it to jump into wild pigs is quite high. There's lots of close interaction. We have GPS collared animals that, I think one GPS collared animal visited one farm 136 times one winter, and lots of overall spatial overlap. So, there's definitely potential for contact and disease transmission for sure, both directly through contact, but also through shared feed. So what happens when these pigs are out there right now and all these swaths sitting in the field and pigs are feeding on them and crapping on them, and that grain is eventually going to be fed to animals. So there are indirect risks as well. So yeah, I think there's reasons that livestock producers should be very concerned about pigs. And to be honest, I thought all of the livestock groups that were at risk would be very strong vocal advocates of, let's get on this. Let's get rid of these things.
Jim clarified, PCO is the pest control officer. So does this fall under provincial? Does this fall under provincial pest control officer jurisdiction?
Well, there's a good question. I don't know that. I don't know. Manitoba Agriculture, Saskatchewan Crop Insurance, has been the lead on this for a number of years now. SARM, Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, was in charge of a control program. And then Saskatchewan Crop Insurance took that over. And so they have been, the SCIC in Saskatchewan has been the main focus of control efforts so far.
Okay.
I don't know what role the pest officers could play. Certainly their knowledge and experience would be incredibly useful, but I haven't seen them engaged on this.
Yeah. Hey, Ryan, this has been fantastic. I always learn something when we have our chats. This seems to me something that should be getting a lot more attention. Clearly, it's important south of the border, the fact that USDA is providing some funding to the Canadian research. So I think that's a statement in itself. So keep up the great work, and thanks a lot for joining us here today.
Great to talk to you, Shaun.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us here today. This has been a lot of fun, a great discussion. Hopefully you learned some things about what's going on in terms of the wild pig population, and really appreciate you joining us. Tomorrow, we're going to talk fall fertilizer. We're talking to Ross McKenzie, former Alberta agriculture employee, and he's one of the experts. Actually, one of the very first people I ever interviewed when I started RealAgriculture.com. So Ross is actually going to be in studio, which will be a lot of fun as he lives here in Lethbridge, Alberta. Don't forget to tune in to RealAg Radio today. We're going to have a great discussion. Chris White with the Canadian Meat Council is going to talk about how meat packers are preparing for a potential wave 2 of COVID-19. What did we learn from the first wave as we try to protect employees and keep the meat supply humming in a second wave? We'll also talk to Marcus Hurley from the Grain Farmers of Ontario about their recent ad asking the federal government for assistance as they try to compete against American subsidies. Thanks a lot, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live, and we'll talk again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.